Hey everyone, it's Selwen here. Let's talk about the Unholy Decay. Now, we have talked about the Unholy previously a few weeks ago, but then there wasn't a lot to it. We talked about class changes, the baseline changes, we talked about Covenant abilities, but now we have the full scope of what Shadowlands is bringing to Unholy and many other specs, practically all specs at this point. And we're going to talk about Legendaries, we're going to talk about Conduits, just for you to have an idea of what new toys you're going to have here in Shadowlands. Now, you now in the pre-patch or in the PTR, depending at what time you are watching this, you already are with some changes. But of course, there's going to be new ranks as you level through Shadowlands, so we're going to talk about that too, but briefly touch on all the baseline changes really briefly, but feel free to skip ahead if you don't want to hear that. Okay, so well, we of course have a lot of new abilities back. We have some unpruned abilities, as you can see here, like Lichborn, Anti-Magic Zone, Sacrificial Pact, providing some extra survivability, some extra utility, or even some extra immunities in the form of Lichborn, and of course with that really cool thematic mechanic of being able to self-heal yourself with death coils. Now, when it comes to new abilities and abilities that you have that have changed, well, you have obviously the Outbreak change that if you played with in the PTR or currently in the pre-patch, if you're watching this from the future, you're obviously going to notice the huge difference that it is on Outbreak, as in your virulent plagues no longer spread during those 6 seconds, which kind of sucks to be honest, and they also last for a few seconds less. So there's that. You need to pay more attention to the way you place your dots. You also have your mastery change, which is obviously wonderful for your scalability potential with the overall spec as we go through the expansion by increasing the damage of not only your shadow damage but your minions. And things like your summon gargoyle, which if you go to the PTR or when the pre-patch is out, you're gonna notice that now you also have it baseline, but it's just a very simple CD. You just press it, you get it for 30 seconds. Looks pretty cool, and in Shadowlands at level 52, you're gonna gain a rank 2 of this ability to make the gargoyle work in the same way as our talent previously worked, or the old Dark Arbiter from Legion, so increasing its damage by runic power that you spent, making that sort of playstyle of building your runic power and then dumping it during your gargoyle window baseline to all Unholy Decays. You also have a similar improvement to your Dark Transformation, which is providing 100 energy to your pets when you use Dark Transformation, which is obviously pretty good as well, as it will allow it to go for more slashes, more of his ability to either spread more wounds if you're using the talent, or to simply deal more damage. And you also have some wonderful synergies in your Legendaries and Conduits that we're gonna talk about. You also have a cooldown reduction on Apocalypse by 15 seconds, which will allow it to align with your Unholy Frenzy, or rather Unholy Strike, which we're going to talk about in your talents, which is brand new. Well, a change to Unholy Frenzy. Death and Decay, just like Outbreak, has gotten that nerf, that AoE, that dreaded AoE nerf that everyone hates, and that now, during your Death and Decay, your Scourge Strike is only going to hit up to 5 enemies, which sucks. But currently, your Defile allows you to retain the mechanic of you being able to hit all targets inside of it, so that's one way to make Defile somewhat worthwhile to take. You also have a couple of new runes. They're not a huge deal for Unholy. The one that feels the most thematic and the most useful potential usefulness outside of using Fallen Crusader is Rune of the Apocalypse, which is making your ghoul apply some little debuffs. Now, currently it's not that powerful, so there you go. You also have a couple of other ones which feel rather useful utility-wise, like Spell Warding or Unending Thirst. Moving over to your talents, so just like your baseline abilities, you do have a couple of changes here. So you have your new Unholy Light, which is a new ability that you can press every 45 seconds that will allow you to apply a damage dot that stacks up to 4 times, but also increasing your minion damage by 5%, increasing per stack. So it's wonderful to stack up with your Gargoyle, with your Dark Transformation and all of that for some really juicy damage, which is pretty cool. You also have a change to Soul Reaper, which is no longer this ability that you can use to get runes back. It's now back to being an execute-like ability with just 8 seconds of a cooldown. You strike up at the enemy, it leaves a 5-second debuff, and if it expires when the enemy is below 35% of health, it explodes, dealing some extra damage. And if the target dies, you get Runic Corruption, so giving you some runes back. So it still has that functionality of giving you runes, so it makes sense to be in this tier, which is buffing your rune generation rather. So that's your new Soul Reaper. By consequence, this is also fixing one of the annoying issues that Unholy has, which is on openers and all of that. You do have a lot of GCDs, a lot of abilities to press, so this change does alleviate that as well, which is pretty good. Your Epidemic is now working with your Sudden Doom procs, which is also awesome. You're no longer gonna have these awkward moments when you get the proc during AoE situations, plus allows you to use it a whole lot more. But remember that spreading your Virulent Plagues now is a little bit more time consuming and a little bit more costly to your runes. And on the last tier, we of course get the fresh new Unholy Strike, which is replacing your Unholy Frenzy. So just like the change to Soul Reaper, this is to alleviate the GCD issue that the spec has in your openers. There was simply too many buttons to press. So essentially what this is providing is essentially replacing your Festering Strike. Works in a pretty similar way to Festering Strike. You're still spending 2 runes, so you're getting that runic power, and it's also dealing some instant damage and applying for Festering wounds, but still has a mechanic of providing you with haste, 15% haste. So works pretty much in the same, it's just saving you a GCD, which is also pretty great. And does align with Apocalypse, but does not align with your other CDs, which is unfortunate. I would rather see this with a 1.5 minute cooldown. The same goes for Apocalypse than actually having both of them at 1.3 minutes. Army of the Damned also got a change. It now has your Magus trait baked into it, so it makes your Apocalypses and Army of the Dead more powerful, and with gear potentially with you reducing the CDs more effectively through your Death Coils and Epidemics, this could prove quite interesting. Then you have your Unholy Pact, which is replacing your old Gargoyle. It's a pretty simple one, pretty boring one personally. It's simply improving your Dark Transformation to make you deal more damage. Essentially your Chains trait that you had here in BFI, and is also increasing your strength by 8%. Not a huge deal, but it does provide some synergies with Infected Claws and Bursting Wounds and some conduits and some legendaries that we're going to talk about. So there's some wonderful synergies there to make your Dark Transformation Ghoul very, very powerful in AoE situations. So let's talk about Legendaries. Yes, now there's a lot of Legendaries coming in Shadowlands. Some of those are class-wide, some of those are quite flavorful. So in the background you can see all of them, but primarily here what I want to discuss is of course the Unholy focused Legendaries, and there's some pretty fun ones that you can use that again provide some interesting synergies, like Frenzied Monstrosity, which is improving your Ghoul even further on top of the baseline changes and on top of talents. That is increasing its attack speed and damage by 20% and yours as well for 15 seconds. Again, it has some wonderful synergies, and you have some conduits that provide some extra synergies to this legendary as well, making your Ghoul a freaking killing machine. You also have the Reanimated Shambler, which is the artifact trait that we add in Legion. Essentially, as you are dealing damage, there's a chance for you to summon this zombie-like creature that is gonna walk slowly towards a mob, explode, dealing AoE damage and spreading wounds. It can be useful in dungeons, for sure. It's also pretty fun to use, but you are very dependent on RNG, so when you compare it to something like Frenzied Monstrosity, something that you can clearly target, and is something that has some wonderful synergies with your Ghoul to make it so powerful. You also have Deadliest Coil, which is decreasing the cost of Deadly Coil by 10 runic power, and it's also increasing the duration of your Dark Transformation by 2 seconds. Again, some nice synergies with your Ghoul, with your Dark Transformation to make that window last for longer. Now you can only equip one legendary, so it's not like you can stack these two legendaries up, but again, you still have some synergies in your talents and conduits and baseline changes again. You also have another one which is directly buffing your minions, which is Pheromones, and it's making your death and decay. While your minions and you stay inside of your death and decay, you gain a buff, a 10% haste buff, with an added utility by making your death and decay ticks have a chance to trigger a very small cower fear, which can be reasonably useful for dungeons to interrupt casts. I remember this from Legion in our blood tree that we had this, and it could prove pretty goddamn useful. So legendaries overall all looking pretty great here for the Unholy. They all have some interesting synergies, some interesting effects that combine really well with many of the changes that the spec had. So let's move over to Covenant abilities and then Conduits. Now, Covenant abilities again was a topic that we discussed a few weeks ago, but some of them have changed a little bit due to Conduits, as we have Conduits that directly buff your Covenant ability. So we have the Kyrian one, which is the most underwhelming one, which is Shackled the Unworthy, a simple dot that you can apply every 1 minute that deals very high damage, and for each rune that you spend, it's going to reduce the cooldown if Shackle of the Unworthy is actually up. This obviously, damage-wise, has a lot of potential, especially with gear, to a point that you'll be able to have this up all the time. And numbers-wise, that is very good, but it's also pretty underwhelming to press. It's not fun at all. Not only that, it's also very weak for AoE situations, since it's a primarily single target ability. But we do have a conduit, and we can discuss conduits more in a little bit, that adds a chance to your Shackled the Unworthy to spread to a nearby target, combating some of the issues with the ability. Nevertheless, still not very fun to press. Then we have the Venthyr ability, which is the Swarming Mist, an AoE ability that also does pretty decent amount of damage, and on top it's providing you runic power, 3 runic power per tick, up to 15 per tick, so a lot of runic power whenever you are in AoE situations, allowing you to spam your epidemic by quite a lot. And in single target is also directly buffing your gargoyle window, since it will allow you to go for more death coils. So pretty solid overall. As for the conduit, it's simply increasing its damage and increasing the dodge chance components that this ability has while you have it active. As for the Necrolord's ability is the Abomination Limb, which is another AoE ability that you just essentially slap people in this very awesome effect, and as it deals damage, it has a chance to grip a random target. Now, the chance to grip a random target is more useful on paper than in practice. It feels very lackluster to use, you can barely target that whatsoever, so outside of the damage, it's simply okay. As for its respective conduit, it's increasing its damage by 50%, which is quite a lot, on the enemy that it pulls. So it's essentially improving its single target damage in a way, but it's not really going to work on bosses or simply enemies that are immune to grips, so it kind of loses a lot of worth. As for the Night Fae ability, it's Death's Due. It's an ability that is going to replace your Death and Decay for something far, far more powerful that you for sure want to click in single target. And in addition to it just looking beautiful and just dealing a lot of damage, it also has a buff component that is increasing your strength and reducing your damage taken per tick up to 15%. This buff is actually something that you can refresh on subsequent Death's Due presses, so it's a wonderful buff to keep up for some extra damage. Likely to be one of the most powerful abilities that you have currently going for Unholy Decays, which is a little bit sad since Night Fae is something that doesn't combine very well with the themes of Death Knight. As for the Conduit, it's simply increasing its damage further. Another thing to keep in mind with Covenants, not the abilities themselves, but your Covenant choices, it's their signature abilities that everyone gets, as the Night Fae Covenant and the Venthyr Covenant are providing mobility type of abilities. Venthyr, the Teleport, Door of Shadows, and Night Fae, Soul Shape, which both provides a tiny teleport and a movement speed buff of 60%, which is very, very valuable for something like the decays, which are extremely slow. So, something to bear in mind as well. So, with that said, let's talk about Soulbinds and Conduits. Now, Soulbinds themselves, I don't want to touch too much on them because it's something that on every class is the same, so it would get very, very repetitive. But I do want to mention a couple of ones which goes in line with your most powerful Covenant abilities. But as it goes for Conduits, with our new wonderful UI here, we have a couple of interesting ones, like, where is it? Internal Hunger, which is directly increasing your Dark Transformation duration by 5 seconds. These 5 seconds can obviously be increased by the level of your conduit, so do bear that in mind as well. But this is again directly synergizing with so many of your talents and so many of the changes and legendaries that you have now going for your Dark Transformation for it to be even more powerful. You also have an improvement to your Sudden Doom procs, increasing the damage of your next Death Coil by 40%. This is also directly synergizing with your legendary that is buffing your Death Coils. You also have one which is increasing the duration of your Virulent Plague with your Scourge Strikes, which is simply nice. And when you AoE with your D&D, and especially if you go for the file, which allows you to hit all targets, this could synergize reasonably well too. And then you also have Convocation of the Dead, which is making your Festering Wound bursts reduce the cooldown of Apocalypse by 0.5 seconds. Again, remember, this may increase. This is obviously directly synergizing really well with your Army of the Damned talent and your legendary, which is buffing your minions with haste during your death in case. So a decent synergy there going as well. And as for your other conduits, not ones which are potency, so DPS ones, you have something like the endurance ones. So pretty simple stuff like improving your anti-magic zone or your death strike healing. Your Lichborn is now also reducing the damage that you take, which is actually pretty nice, especially as this percentage of 5% gets increased with a more powerful conduit that you may get in the future. And as for finesse ones which are more based around utility, you get a reduced cooldown for Icebound Fortitude, which is decent enough. You get an extra movement speed increase on your Death's Advance, which can be very useful again for a very slow spec. And you also have Spirit Drain, which is making your Mind Freeze grant 5 runic power on interrupts, and again this may increase with higher item level conduits. So this is functioning pretty much like Demon Hunter's Interrupt, which is also pretty nice. And you also have an Ending Grip, which allows your Death Grip to slow the enemy movement speed by 25% until cancelled. Now you do have a couple of interesting soulbinds here specifically that, for an example, we have this one which your interrupts apply a dot. Now this is interesting because we also have a conduit, a finesse conduit, which is not a DPS conduit that is benefiting your interrupts. So I find that synergy there quite interesting on these two slots. And then on this tier here, on the last trait rather, we also have an increase to your mastery and health as you deal damage, and you get this buff, redirected anima, and up to 10. And then when you use your Death's Due, you get that said mastery stack for 30 seconds. Mastery is obviously very powerful for you right now due to the changes of increasing the damage to your minions and your shadow damage. So not only Death's Due is very powerful right now, the soulbinds themselves also feel pretty great for Unholy. Okay guys, that pretty much covers the Unholy. Overall is playing pretty well, especially after the changes where we no longer have so many GCDs in your openers due to the changes to Soul Reaper and Unholy Frenzy that is now Unholy Strike. It's not perfect, there's obviously a couple of issues, no spec is perfect, but currently right now is playing pretty great, and there's some wonderful synergies, some wonderful class design overall in your legendaries, in your conduits, in your covenant abilities, and the synergies in between them, with of course the changes to your baseline abilities and talents. So do let me know what you think down below of Unholy Decay. Are you excited to play with it in Shadowlands and unlock all of those powers, or you prefer Frost, that we're gonna talk about next? Okay guys, so do let me know that down below, and as always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you all next time.